Hello, everyone, and welcome. We're happy to have you with us today. My name is Carrie Ferg, and I'm your host for the Manta Trends webcast, Social Marketing, Turn Your Story into Sales. We hope you'll tweet about today's event using hashtag Manta Trends. I'd like to take a few minutes to cover some important housekeeping items about the event. Let's first talk about your screen. During the webinar, you should see a slide area, which will allow you to view the webinar. On top of the slide area are three tabs: Ask a Question, Attachments, and Rate This. Click on the Ask a Question tab to ask a question anytime during the webcast. We'll do our best to respond during Q&A at the end of the event. If you're having technical difficulties, please email webinarhelp@manta.com. My colleague Graham is answering your technical questions, so just send him a note. I'd like to introduce our expert today, Bryan Orr. Bryan has owned an award-winning HVAC small business for more than 10 years. He is also a contributing writer for several publications, including Entrepreneur. Bryan hosts and produces podcasts such as the Wow Small Business Show. He works with businesses, brands, and executives to help convert good stories into strong customer relationships. We're glad to have you today, Bryan.
Well, thank you, Carrie. I really appreciate you having me here today. And to start with, I want to just share a story with you. About 11 years ago, we started our business. We're a family business, an HVAC and construction contracting business. And when we founded our business, we decided to name it KLO Services, which means integrity. Now, when we first started the business, I used to just tell people, our business means integrity and we do business with integrity. And I realized that it wasn't landing. A couple of years ago, though, something happened that really changed the way I looked at my business. I had a gentleman who was working at a job site where the owner was not present, and he was just doing a regular air conditioning maintenance. When he put the air conditioning panel back on the side of the air conditioner, he ran a screw into the aluminum tubing in the coil. Now, the bad news with this is that when you have aluminum tubing, there's no good way to patch that tubing on an air conditioner, which means that we essentially had to replace the entire air conditioner if we wanted to fix it. It would have been so easy in that moment for us to just say, hey, you have a leak in your unit that we just found. But when Larry called me and said, boss, what do we do? The answer was clear. The answer was, obviously, we have to do the right thing, and we're going to end up spending $4,000 to $5,000 replacing this customer's 10-year-old air conditioner in order to get them up and running. As you can see, that way of communicating the story was much more powerful than anything I could have done where I was just pitching an answer saying, this is who we are. We're a business that does business with integrity. The story is what really gave it punch. Stories are powerful. Now, why are stories powerful? That's really the question. Stories are powerful because they're much more interesting. Now, don't ask me why, but our brains are hardwired to listen for story. As soon as you can tell that I'm taking you down a narrative track where you don't know what's going to happen next, it really engages you. It brings you in. It draws you into the story. Also, stories are relatable because you can put yourself in that position. When you're thinking about the position that I'm in where I said that I run a business of integrity, and then all of a sudden you have that moment of truth, we've all been there. We've all been in that place where we say one thing about ourselves and we have to see if it's actually true. So stories are relatable. The litmus test for whether or not something is a story is this. Does it keep the person who you're talking to or the audience who you're speaking to, does it keep them wondering what happens next? Also, I want to mention you can ask questions that we'll answer at the end over questions. Now, where do you start, though? That's the question that I get most often is how do you start telling stories? Well, anything that happens to you in business, you can turn into a story. And just like what happened with Larry and I, we had another situation recently where we came to a job site where someone had left some ductwork unsealed, and we found this and saved the customer a lot of money. Now, I could have just said it the way I just said it, which is just to relay facts, or I could walk you through this story and distill it down to a single truth. That's how you start. So in the story with Larry, the single truth is that we do business by integrity. So we operate the same way when people are watching and when they're not watching. So when I start with that in mind, I can get to that point. That's where we bring to the resolution of the story. Now, in that particular story, if I had started and told you exactly what was going to happen right at the beginning, then it wouldn't have worked. A good example would be if I said to you, hey, something funny happened the other day. A fireman saved my cat from the tree. And then I started to tell you about the whole story of what happened that was funny. Well, I've ruined the story because I've told you what happened before I even told the story. So you want to make sure that you save the resolution until the end, and that helps make it a story because it keeps everyone wondering what happens next. Now, when you think about, because really the promise of this presentation is how can stories help you sell? Well, people do business with people who they know, like, and trust. And the old saying is that when all things are equal, people do business with those they know, like, and trust. When all things are unequal, people still do business with those they know, like, and trust. And stories help people really understand where you're coming from. It helps them understand your why more than just the what. In business, we so often lead with the what. If somebody asks you, what do you do for your business, you say, well, I'm an air conditioning contractor, or I'm an insurance agent, or whatever the case may be, instead of really connecting with them and creating a bridge. And stories create bridges. Now let's talk about some different ways to use story. And the first and most obvious way to use story is when you're face-to-face with somebody. Now you think, how can you use a story when you're face-to-face with somebody? Well, put it this way. When someone comes up to you, one of the first questions, especially in professional networking settings, is, so what do you do? Or what do you do for a living? Well, the answer to that question can either be a very simple answer that everybody gives and it's totally forgettable, or it can be something extremely unique. When people ask me what I do nowadays, I say I help executives unlock their inner interesting. Now, what's interesting about that is that it doesn't really answer what I do, not completely, and it forces the other person to ask me more about that. Well, tell me more. Well, then that gives me an opportunity to give examples of cases where I've helped executives unlock their inner interesting, and it continues to advance that conversation. It's a story because it makes the person who's speaking wonder what happens next. Now, you can always use stories in place of facts. When someone says, give me an example of something, you can just give facts of ways in which you save your customers money, or you can give examples and stories of ways in which you save your customers money, for example. You can also tell stories when you're presenting. Now, when you're presenting, it's great to lead with a story. And the reason why you do that is because your audience gets a feeling like they know you. Like they've been there before and like they can understand where you're coming from. It gives them that tone, that emotional tone that you want. Next, you can tell stories or have stories prepared when something goes wrong. The reason why I have a picture of Steve Jobs here is, first of all, he's an excellent storyteller, but secondly, one of his most famous stories he ever told was when his clicker stopped working when he was presenting one of his Apple products. So he's clicking the clicker and it's not working, and he goes into a story about him and Steve Wozniak when they were in college and how they created a TV jammer and how it kind of freaked out everyone in the dorm. And it was an excellent story. Everybody was laughing, and it gave an opportunity that for something that would have normally been a very awkward moment, he took that opportunity and told a story. And finally, like I've already stated, stories help you connect emotionally, which ultimately that is really the cornerstone of people knowing you, liking you, and trusting you, is if they can understand and they can connect with you emotionally. You also can communicate your brand with story. And I have a couple examples here of where brand can communicate with story. But before we get into the examples, I want you to think about what your customers are actually buying from you. So if you're an insurance agent, are they buying insurance? Well, not really. I mean, they are buying insurance, but they're really buying peace of mind, or they're buying compliance with the government in the cases of insurances that are required. But if you think of it in terms of selling insurance, then you're going to take the wrong approach. You're going to take an approach that doesn't work. So the picture I have here is the Allstate Mayhem. And if you remember, he talks about protecting you from mayhem like him, and he gives lots of different examples. Everything from something falling off the back of a car to him being a do-it-yourselfer, injuring himself. But really what he's communicating with story is that Allstate protects you from the unexpected. So it takes you to a place where you don't, when you watch those commercials, yeah, you know that something awful is going to happen at the end, but you're locked in because you want to see what happens next, and it's usually pretty funny. An example on the other side of the emotional spectrum that I love to show people is the Acura crash test dummy commercial. And I don't know if you've seen this commercial, but it's been playing for quite some time. In this commercial, what happens is you see a guy who's placing very lifelike looking people into a car. And you can tell it's a test track. And as he's placing them into the car, you start to realize that it's actually his own family that he's placing into this car. And only when he hits the button to actually test the car do you realize that they actually change back to crash test dummies. And you realize that what's going on is this guy who's testing the Acura for its safety is actually imagining his own family in that car, and he's taking it very seriously. And so in that moment, Acura is not selling a car. They're selling a promise that they protect your family, which is something that's extremely emotional. But it does it via story. They could just say, we're Acura, we protect your family. Well, that's not a really great message. But when they do it in that way, you can understand exactly what they're saying, and whether or not you before that believed that Acura was selling you protecting your family or not. In that moment, you can connect with that reality. So when you're telling stories with a brand, you want to understand the fears and desires of your customers, and you want to establish those stakes in the stories that you tell. These are a couple good examples, but there are myriads of really good examples of businesses that connect with the fears and desires of their customers using story, not just using facts.
Thank you, Bryan. We'll open it up now for a few questions from the audience. If you haven't asked your question yet and you have one for Bryan, now is the time to use the question tab to submit your question, and we'll try to get to it within the next few minutes. So, Bryan, I have one question here from an audience member. What about social barriers and getting over the nostalgic culture of different industries? In the construction industry, for example, guys tell stories all the time, but how do you change the stage of storytelling from guys in the field, which has been going on for centuries, to potential clients looking for a contractor on their smartphone, which is a modern-day reality? How do you keep their attention and pull to their human desire to listen to stories while keeping it credible? Through a blog? ?
Okay, so I think if I can distill the question down, you're basically saying that it's about social barriers, but it's really about the context. You know, that there's certain very soundbite context that may be difficult, whereas when you're standing on a job site with some of your friends and you're a construction worker and you're just kind of shooting the breeze, it's normal for people to tell stories in that context. And yes, it is a challenge. I remember an example of this. Someone said, "Well, you can't tell a story in a very short space." And I think it was Ernest Hemingway who said, "Oh, yes, I can." And his story that he told was baby shoes unused for sale. That's an example where, I mean, it's you know, like you can feel the emotion of that story in a sentence where it's you want to know why are these baby shoes unused and for sale? What's the story there? What happened? And you can do that in your business. It takes a little bit of work, and it takes really first understanding your customers and knowing the questions to ask.
Thanks, Bryan. I have another question here for you. How do you apply stories to social media or online marketing?
It's a version of a similar question, which is how do you bring people in when you have a very short space? You know, we use story a lot in our business where we're highlighting different members of our staff, and we'll do that on Facebook and Twitter, and we'll talk about them and what makes them unique and kind of taking through some stories there. But really, in a lot of cases, you just use questions that are open-ended. So you leave an open loop that draws people into the full story. And in a lot of cases, you can do that the best place to do that is on a blog, via a podcast, via a webinar, and then also speaking. But largely, story in its broader form is used when you're speaking either to an audience or when you're communicating face-to-face with someone.
I have another question here that's kind of interesting. How do you communicate honesty and integrity, but don't open yourself up to being taken advantage of by a potential client?
It's interesting, you know, that even goes beyond story, but that comes down to my base business ethos, which is that if I go into it being afraid of being taken advantage of, then I'm never going to be fully vulnerable. And if I'm never vulnerable, then I'm never going to be super effective. So I don't protect myself. Eventually, if I am being taken advantage of, then I just close the relationship and just say it's not working for me. But I don't go into it being worried about whether I'm going to be taken advantage of or not. Which that's maybe a little idealistic, but that's the world I live in.
I like it, Bryan. So which marketing channels are stories most effectively used in?
Very good question. So the two, as far as marketing go, would be audio. So that's why I have a podcast. Podcasting is a really good place to tell stories because you get a little bit of space to do it. And the other is in writing. So if you have a blog for your business, stories are some of the most effective ways to communicate via writing. And then obviously, if you're doing speaking, if you're at a chamber event and they ask you to talk, come with a story. Don't come with a, this is what we do and here's our best offer. That sort of stuff is so played. But if you look at really any opportunity and figure out a way how to lead people into story, that's how you're going to build relationships over time.
Okay, and I think we'll ask one more question. I'm not a good writer. Does that matter when it comes to storytelling?
That's another very good question, and the reason it's a good question is because they're two different questions. So no, you can be a great storyteller without being a great writer. In fact, some of the best storytellers from history were people who were essentially illiterate, who could tell a story and who could weave a story. So here's what I suggest: if you're not a good writer, pull out your smartphone, go on the Memos app or whatever the recording app is on your phone, and just talk. And you can always have that transcribed. You can go to rev.com as an example, rev.com, and you can have stuff transcribed for $1 a minute. And then you can give that to an editor who can edit it down into something that makes sense. So I would say if you can tell a story, if you can talk, then you can tell a story. And so get to it.
That's good advice. One more question here, Bryan. We sell houses with a gated community in an unsafe country. How do we exploit people's fear of crime without coming across in an offensive way?
Well, and that's where you being vulnerable about shared experiences is much more effective than saying, if you love your family, you'll come to our gated community. That's kind of a aggressive way of doing it, but Acura is a perfect example of that. They're not saying that you don't care about your family if you use a different car. They're just connecting with the shared experience of we all know what it's like to feel that deep need, visceral need to protect our families. And so you can tell any story that relates to that and then tie that together to why it's a good value for them to live in your gated community.
Thank you, Bryan. We've got to wrap it up now, but if you have questions for Bryan or want to get in touch with him, his Twitter handle and his website are listed under attachments, as well as are all of the Manta webinars, and they're all available on demand, so you can watch them, listen to them after the fact as well. Thank you for presenting today, Bryan, and everyone for attending.
Thank you so much for having me. It was a joy.